And we are back on the 0 hour. The old song says the banks are made of marble with a guard at every door. And someone who knows a lot about those banks is Nomi Prins. She is a journalist, a speaker, a TV and radio commentator. I've seen her on a lot. She is a former Wall Street executive. She's written, I think, 6 books, including Other People's Money and the book we're going to discuss today, which has just come out in paperback. It is All the President's Bankers, the Hidden Alliances That Drive American Power. And it's well worth reading. Nomi, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on.
Now, this book has just come out in paperback. It was published when 2014, I believe, right?
Yeah, just about a year ago.
So I guess I would ask it, first of all, briefly, although you've done this a million times and you must be tired of it, so I'll only make you do it for 20 seconds, but basically your summary of the book rather than mine.
Thank you. Basically, it is a forensic analysis, really, going through presidential archives and the like of our past 19 presidents and their relationships, their personal relationships with the top bankers of their day, starting from the turn of the 1900s, going through the Obama administration, and how that affected American policy domestically and on an international stage.
And by the way, forensic analysis sounds boring, and it is not boring.
It was actually fun. I mean, forensic is kind of the CSI term, but basically I went into real original documents, and so I very much perused the folders of letters, of telegrams, of handwritten notes, and so forth, starting from the earlier administrations. And, of course, the more recent ones don't exist yet. There's going to probably be lots of problems in getting any of that information from an accurate perspective going on for years from now. But up through at least the Reagan administration and to a portion also the first George Bush administration as well as the Clinton administration, that's all in the book from original documentation.
You also very wisely chose to have short, punchy sections in it and to have chapters like the early 1960s, Go-Go Youth, Murders and Global Finance. So it really is quite readable, quite at the same time being very exhaustive on the subject. I found myself wishing while I was reading it that I could somehow just store it all in active memory so that I could refer to this when I'm, going about my day or disagreeing with people. Now, or debating, I should say, as more civil word, but Nomi Prins, just let's talk a little bit about your background. You were a executive with Goldman Sachs, right?
Yes, Goldman Sachs was actually my last stop on a four-company tour over 15 years of Wall Street in London and as well as in Wall Street in New York City. So yes, I had gotten up to the position of managing director of Goldman Sachs, having started as a programmer analyst at the Chase Manhattan Bank as my first stop, with Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns, which no longer exist, in between.
Right, no connection, though, just to make that clear, between their non-existence and your employment there. I mean, but I used to work for AIG, and I try to also make that caution about their experience, my tenure there. But so you were basically a technical person?
I was a strategist. I was an analyst. I was a programmer, and I also I met with central banks, insurance companies, multi-billion-dollar asset managers around the world, really also in terms of advising and analyzing from a quantitative perspective, products they bought, how they could rejigger their portfolios of assets or whatever it might be. And I wound up running, actually, for Bear Stearns in London, their analytics department, which covered a number of different products, as well as the credit derivatives analytics department at Goldman Sachs right before, well, I left somewhat before credit derivatives became known as the toxic instruments that they are. So I left before that. Actually, my first book, Other People's Money, talked about the growth of, or where the growth of that market was going to go, how hot that new market was, and what the dangers could be because of the lack of transparency in it. And of course, that manifested in the financial crisis of 2008.
Yes, so that was an accurate call on your part. I'm struck, Nomi Prins, just hearing your background directly from you. There's a certain similarity in the sense that, my own background with AIG and other places, I was mostly on the risk management, insurance, healthcare, benefits, those sides. But I also, there were times when, and I was just curious to know if you had this experience, there were times, especially when I was younger and, 29 or 30 and, getting, memos from Hank Greenberg or whatever, figure this out. There were times when I would think to myself, let's say in my case, let's say it's about, the replacement of defined benefit pensions with, 401ks and so on. There were times when I would start thinking to myself after a certain point, when the learning curve had passed a certain moment, I don't see this working out well. And is there something I don't know, or is there something they don't know, or is there something they don't care about? Did you have moments like that in your career?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the last years, including the 2 years I was at Goldman and the last part of my being at Bear Stearns, there was certainly a massive change in how these things were viewed, how these instruments were viewed, and also how, I look at things and wonder, how are we doing this to clients? I mean, there's one particular, and this is kind of constant throughout these years, instance I remember with a central bank where we had sold a certain piece of what we now know as the toxic asset, but this was before, so this wasn't subprime mortgages. These were other sorts of mortgages in there, and under the argument that it was AAA and therefore it had high integrity, it was going to pay them back. It fit into their parameters because they could only take AAA things. However, it was a part of a more complex security, and it had no liquidity, meaning once it was sold to that central bank, they really had no market to sell it anywhere else. They were kind of stuck with it no matter what happened to it. And that really became one of the major stories of the collapse in ultimately financial crisis of 2008, because banks like Goldman, like Bear, and so forth were selling these products to companies that, or countries or cities or towns or pension funds that really could never get rid of them, could never sell them back in the case of our prices going down, their value going down. So their value was indicated as higher to begin with than it should have been, but also there was nowhere to put it if things were going down. So they were stuck with these deteriorating kind of assets, and that was a big problem throughout all of the financial crisis. And in general, this idea of the hot potato of Wall Street, of trying to send your worst junk to places where it would have to basically sit and fester and lose them money.
It's interesting because you were in the middle of that. I wasn't, but we'd get briefed at the various companies I worked for, and I just remember being maybe in my late 30s. This was going back a little while, and these guys coming in their early 30s to present this stuff, and they had better teeth, better hair, and they had guys with them with like binders filled with equations that didn't seem to cohere. But I just thought, either they're way smarter than me, or the world is changing in some way I can't perceive. And I think it was maybe the former, but certainly the latter. You were right in the middle of it. What made you decide to ultimately step away from it?
Well, I left right in the wake of the Enron crisis, so the last basically financial crisis. I had for those 2 years before, really decided that this wasn't kind of where I needed to be. It didn't match my sort of moral compass, where things were going. It wasn't. I thought life was too short to continue to be in what I considered a very sort of commercially oppressive environment, and I wanted to go. And I think between 9/11, while I was down on Wall Street at the time, working at Goldman, and sort of that experience, and just being in the environment, and also the sort of Enron frauds and how how that was manifesting from things I had seen and I had known were going to happen, and from having wanted to be more open with certain positions and look at their downsides than my management wanted to really contribute to doing. All of that, all together, it was a combination of that personal decision as well as the professionalism that was really declining rapidly into those corporate scandals, which were associated with banks as well. Enron is noted as a major corporate scandal, as was WorldCom and the whole energy and telecom scandals of the time, but they were very much fueled by arrangements with the major banks, who, of course, got off pretty much unscathed from those experiences and being, participants in those fraudulent practices.
And, it's interesting because we're talking with Nomi Prins, author of All the President's Bankers. It's interesting because even in the insurance industry, there were Enron-like scandals that preceded it, but Enron was larger and Enron struck the public fancy. Did you find it hard? I hope you don't mind this question, but I'll answer it myself. Did you find it hard to walk away from the money? Because I did. I was not independently. I had not made the kind of money where I didn't have to work anymore or anything like that. I had, in my case, I had kids and so on. The money was nice. It was not, Rockefeller money, but it was very nice. And I found that a challenging adjustment. If you don't have to answer a question if you don't want to, but I'm just curious.
No, and it's good of you to sort of talk about your experience. I mean, it certainly was an adjustment. I am still, I now work as a writer. I picture ideas that make substantially less money when they are placed than any remotely anything like what the pays are on Wall Street, like nowhere remotely near. And I think I just knew I needed to do something different, and I don't know if the money at that point was enough to keep me in that sort of toxic environment. So I needed to have something to go towards, which in my case was writing, before I officially was like, that's it, mm-hmm. That's enough, and resigned. But yes, certainly there's certainly no comparison of the lifestyles or of the money that's made. But that said, I personally feel better about creating a piece that even a few people read for whatever reason than having done a deal on behalf of some senior manager climbing up the ladder or ultimately into Washington or what it might have been at a Goldman Sachs. I mean, I feel more productive and connected and freer in that experience than anything, certainly in the last years that I was on Wall Street.
Well, that's a great explanation, Nomi Prins. And in my case, I had to get very depressed first with what I was doing before I could finally make the transition. And yes, I've had my moments where I thought, well, if 3 people read this and are moved by it, maybe it me. Keith Richards said, if you beat on a log with a stick and somebody dances to it, you've done your job. So I guess I would say, why write this book in 2014, All the President's Bankers, which is now out in paperback? What compelled you to write it? I mean, as you say, it is a very thorough analysis of the relationship between presidents and the financial industry. But what was your motivation for writing it at that moment?
I think I wanted, there were so many books out, including one of my own that takes a pillage about the financial crisis and sort of the more recent history and evolution of that crisis. And there didn't seem to be any books that really looked at how the relationships between Wall Street and Washington not just led to that crisis, but how they just led to so many decisions on a smaller domestic and broader foreign basis. And one of the things that actually struck me was that there were these 6 banks that today and in the into the crisis really control most of our deposits and our assets, derivatives trading assets, and so forth, and have such tremendous influence on everything that happens to individuals and politics and so forth. But what was interesting to me, and I had actually written a novel before that book, before All the President's Bankers, where just randomly I captured a scene. It was about the 1929 crash, and randomly I was going through some newspaper clippings for the novel, nothing near the research I did for all the President's Bankers, but there was a scene in there where these six bankers. The scene was actually really took place, but I mean it was in a work of historical fiction, but the impetus was actual. Where they were sitting there trying to figure out how to save the markets, the stock markets from going down. And in most cases, they had been the ones that had inflated them, either through their individual activities or their bank's activities or through their clients or their relationships with, at the time, some of the presidents and prior presidents by allowing them to do this. And so there they are sitting there, these big six banks. And the word Big Six was coined at the time, actually. And here we are, almost today with the Big Six. And I thought, wait a minute, what's the deal with the six? And so that's really kind of how it started, and then it sort of evolved out of that into the relationship with the White House. And, of course, presidents and administrations are a lot easier to track because they have archives and libraries, and you can, find documents if you look hard enough and are organized enough about it to really see what the relationships were. And I did not know, but I found that in almost all cases with all presidents, there was a personal relationship with those presidents and or their Treasury secretaries, and a portion, if not six, major bankers of their times. I mean, in almost all cases. So some of it was just, let me look into this, and then other material in the book came out of the research in the archives, which I hadn't found in any other book. And so it was a combination of things that really propelled me to do this specific book in the way that it ultimately came out.
So we know, and I guess as a closing theme for discussion, we know that, or reportedly, Teddy Roosevelt, when J.P. Morgan said, why didn't you just send your man around to see my man and they could fix it up, Roosevelt reportedly said, I don't want to fix it up. I wonder now, it's 2015. I felt that for years after the 2008 crisis, we had a teaching moment where we could really help people understand the relationship between finance and the general economy and the relationship between Wall Street and politics and maybe do something about it. Has that teaching moment passed? Are we back to business as usual, Nomi Prins?
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, just the fact that all of these big six banks, for example, are all bigger than they were before the crisis is one kind of glaring clue that we haven't really changed anything. And sure, they are saying that they're safer, but why wouldn't they? And also, they've gotten a lot of subsidies and bailouts from the government, and they continue to benefit from certain policies like the Federal Reserve zero interest rate policy, which gives them money at zero to use to leverage into other types of trading in derivatives and the like. So none of that has really changed. I mean, some of the same heads are still running their banks, some aren't, but the new people have popped up. But the modus operandi really remains the same. I mean, if anything, it's worse because of this extra government support combined with the fact that they are bigger and control more capital.
And the absence of prosecutions, I would add to that, meaning that
right.
They now are very clear that they can break the law with impunity, which is disturbing. But we do have books like yours. We have the conversation, the discussion continues. All the President's Bankers, the hidden alliances that drive American power. I recommend that people read it. And Nomi Prins, I thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much.
I'm RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.